Hey guys, Megan here, and today is another installment of my Journey to Jane Austen series. Now, I wasn't planning on doing two parts in March, but I have so much to say on the first two books I've read for this series so far, and I have at least one more that I'm going to read this month, so I thought better split it up. So, a little bit of background. I am doing this project called Journey to Jane Austen because in a few months I am going to England to visit all of Jane Austen's homes, her birthplace, the place where she was buried, like all that stuff. I'm doing everything Jane Austen. So, in order to prepare for this trip, I am rereading her novels again, as well as reading some nonfiction books about her. So, this month, now I'll just recap real quick. In February, I read Emma, and I read What Matters in Jane Austen by John Mullen, and I will link those videos below, all the stuff that I did on Jane Austen. Now, I'll just link the playlist. Now, for March, my plan was to read Northanger Abbey and Sense and Sensibility if I have time, as well as Jane Austen at Home by Lucy Worsley. That's on my my Kobo. So I have read these two already, and I've started Jane Austen at Home. So today I thought I would discuss these two books, Northanger Abbey, and Sense and Sensibility. Now, before I get into it, I have a little game for us. I'm going to quote two quotes, one from Northanger Abbey and one from Sense and Sensibility, and I want you to write down below who you think said those quotes, and then at the end of the video, so comment that as soon as I read the quotes, and then at the end of the video, I will say who said those quotes. The first quote is simply, "What good does talking do?" And the second quote is, "I hate money." So, I would love to hear who you think said those quotes. Okay, now before I really get into this, I should just put a spoiler warning out there. There will be spoilers on Sense and Sensibility and Northanger Abbey, so just so you know. So let's start with Northanger Abbey because that is, I'll just stick it right there. Let's see if it stays. That might fall down. So yeah, start with Northanger Abbey. Northanger Abbey is the story of Catherine Morland. She has grown up in a big family in a small village. She is sent with some family friends, the Allens, to Bath, where she makes new friends and acquaintances. She meets her crush, Henry Tilney, and his sister Eleanor. She meets the Thorpes, Isabella, her friend, and John Thorpe, her brother, who just won't leave her alone. And then eventually she goes with the Tilneys, Mr. Tilney and Eleanor, and their father, General Tilney. She goes with them to their house, Northanger Abbey. This was my third or fourth time reading Northanger Abbey. The last time I read it, which was 2.5 years ago, Catherine drove me crazy. Her naivete was so irritating to me, and it was like, stop letting these people push you around. Like, can't you see what they're doing? Like, it just drove me crazy. When I read it the first time, I think I was, I don't know, in my teens, early to mid-teens, I identified with Catherine. I was like, how could she say no to the Thorpes and her brother who were pressuring her to go driving? Like, I kind of understood where she was coming from. This time reading it, I had a different perspective. I think I had more grace for Catherine. I was like, okay, she's young, she's naive. Okay, I can get it. I can get on board. I'm not in the same boat as she is, but I understand. Now, Catherine's good friend, Isabella, who she meets in Bath. I mean, they're friends for like 2 weeks, and they're like, oh, you're my best friend ever, you're my family, blah, blah, blah. Like, the first time they meet, they basically pledge their undying friendship. So, Isabella is a couple years older than Catherine. Catherine feels like she's a bit wiser. Isabella is more worldly, and she's less naive for sure, but she's also the epitome of insincerity. Like, she manipulates, she lies all the time to Catherine. And Catherine does not pick up on this because Catherine is the epitome of directness, honesty, purity. Like, she says what she means, and she doesn't say what she doesn't mean, and she expects other people to act the same way, but other people are not acting that way. Catherine believes the best in people, and she takes everything at face value, which are good qualities to have, but in this world, she needs to understand that not everybody does that, and throughout the course of this book, she does learn to understand that. So a particular example that I'm thinking of where Catherine shows that she can see beyond words and see into the meaning behind the words is that Anne Thorpe, she's another sister of Isabella and John. And when Catherine says, no, I will not go driving with you, he picks his sister Mariah to go driving with him, and his sister Anne is left behind. And Catherine asks Anne, like, how do you feel about that? And she's like, oh, I'm fine. I didn't even want to go driving. I don't care about that. But Catherine can tell that she did want to go driving, that she's sad she was left behind and that Mariah was picked and not her. So that is one place where Catherine can see beyond the words, and she does have compassion on Anne. Another thing that I love, this is near the beginning of the book, before Catherine is really realizing that people can read into her words, or that she can read into other people's words. One of my favorite things is that she's just talking with Eleanor and she's like, oh, where's your brother? Yeah, he's such a good dancer. I really like him. Like she's just going on about Henry and asking about Henry. And Jane Austen says, like, when they parted, Eleanor had a better idea of what Catherine was feeling than Catherine realized herself. So it's like she kind of gave away to Eleanor without even realizing it that she has feelings for Henry. So I thought that was really sweet and funny. Another example of Catherine actually being able to see behind the words, to see the motive behind the words, is when Isabella writes a letter. She has already broken it off with James. She's fooled around with Captain Tilney, Henry and Eleanor's other brother. And she sends the letter like, oh, it's all fine, whatever. I'm missing your brother, James. Like, tell me, how is he? And basically she's trying to get Catherine to get James to forgive her and put in a good word for her. And Catherine sees this. She sees it. She doesn't just go like, oh yeah, poor Isabella. I'm sure she must miss James. That's what she might have done at the beginning of the book. But at this point, she's like, no, I can see through this and I'm not taking the bait. However, around the same time, Catherine shows her naivete again when they're going to have a lunch at Henry's place. So he lives in a parsonage, and he's going to have his father, his sister, and Catherine over for lunch. And General Tilney's like, oh, don't put any work into it. I don't need anything big. Like, don't go into too much trouble to make a big feast or anything. And so Catherine's like, oh, okay. Like, he doesn't really care what we're eating. And then she shows up and she's like, Henry, like, why did you put all this work into this? You've put so much work into, your father said he didn't need much to eat. Like, he said not to go all fancy or to go all out. And Henry's just like, he doesn't even explain. And then she notices the general seems not to be surprised by the feast. He just seems to be like, oh yeah, this is what I expected. So once again, she's kind of taking what the general says at face value and not seeing that actually he means the opposite of what he said. Let's talk about the totally not timeless, the question of the 21st century regarding Northanger Abbey, and that is Henry Tilney a mansplainer? Now, I can totally see how he would be a mansplainer. He says ridiculous things, and he always is explaining and teaching things to Catherine. So if you take all this seriously, yeah, he's totally a mansplainer. But if you see it as he's got a twinkle in his eye and he's kind of teasing about it, then he's not a mansplainer. He's just making jokes. So I prefer to look at it at that second way, that he's got a twinkle in his eye and he's just kind of teasing and joking, because it's more enjoyable for me than to read about a mansplainer who's supposed to also be charming. I would rather not think that way. So I just prefer to go with that second option. Another perspective on Henry that I thought was so interesting, Bonnets at Dawn, they're a great literary podcast. They talk about Jane Austen, the Brontes, lots of other women from that era who are writing. And they had a guest the other day, Lydia Craig, and she had a very interesting perspective on Henry Tilney. So I'll just loosely quote her here. She said, Henry gets along so well with his sister Eleanor. He's always helping her. He's really serving her in such a wonderful, loving way. And when he's in those feminine circles, he never feels emasculated by it. So I thought that was like a really good perspective on Henry. I was like, that's lovely. That's true. Now, one thing I have not talked about here yet is that Northanger Abbey is a parody on Gothic fiction. Now, I know that it's a good idea to read a lot of Gothic fiction related to Northanger Abbey, so like especially Udolpho, like the Mysteries of Udolpho, all that stuff. I haven't bothered with doing that. I don't really care that much about Gothic fiction. In fact, it's one of the reasons why Northanger Abbey isn't higher up on my list of Jane Austen favorites, because I just really don't care about Gothic fiction, like Wuthering Heights is not one of my favorites, all that. So, but this is a parody. So one really funny moment that I thought was so great is that when Henry walks in to the assembly rooms in Bath, and he has Eleanor with him for the first time, it says like in Gothic fiction and in a lot of movies, like modern movies that you'd see today, Catherine would think that Eleanor was his wife or his love, and she would just be horrified. I'll read the quote here because what I can say is not nearly as good as what Jane Austen says. So hold on, here we go. Catherine immediately guessed to be his sister, thus unthinkingly throwing away a fair opportunity of considering him lost to her forever by being married already, instead of turning of a death-like paleness and falling in a fit on Mrs. Allen's bosom. Catherine sat erect in the perfect use of her senses and with cheeks only a little redder than usual. So I love that. She doesn't go, oh no, it's his wife or it's his girlfriend. She goes, oh, I know he has a sister. That's probably his sister. And it totally is. So I love that she's kind of being like, if this was an actual Gothic book, this is what Catherine would do, but it's not. This is more like real life, and this is what she did. The thing about Northanger Abbey is that it is so painfully awkward. It's just, there's so much awkwardness. There's, John Thorpe awkwardly proposing to her, but not proposing to her at all, and her not realizing what's going on, and him dragging her away from the Tilneys and making her stand them up, and her searching in the Tilneys' house because she thinks that Mrs. Tilney was murdered by General Tilney, and Mr. Tilney discovering her. There's just so many awkward things about Northanger Abbey, and that is another reason why Northanger Abbey is my least favorite Jane Austen. Even though I'm saying that this is my least favorite, I still love it because all of Jane Austen is amazing. But if you want to find out more about my ranking of Jane Austen, just check out my ranking video, which will be in the Jane Austen playlist. Unashamedly plugging my videos. So that's all I'm going to say on Northanger Abbey. Now I will talk about Sense and Sensibility. Now, Sense and Sensibility is a bit thicker than Northanger Abbey, so I don't know if this will work. It is working. Okay, let's talk about Sense and Sensibility, Jane Austen's first published novel. Sense and Sensibility is the story of two sisters, Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood. They, basically at the beginning of the novel, their father dies and they have to leave their home along with their mother and their younger sister Margaret because their half-brother John is inheriting their home, the estate of Norland Park. They are not allowed to live there anymore. And instead of John doing the right thing and the thing that his father asked him, like made him promise on his deathbed to provide for his stepmother and half-sisters, instead of doing that, he does nothing for them. So they go and they live in a cottage far off that one of Mrs. Dashwood's relatives gives her. Now, in the meantime, before they move, Eleanor falls in love with Edward Ferrars, her half-brother's wife's brother. So, kind of her brother-in-law, but totally not related at all in any way. She falls in love with him, he falls in love with her. They move to this small cottage. Marianne, the other sister, meets her dream man, Willoughby, Mr. John Willoughby. And in the meantime, another man, Colonel Brandon, has fallen in love with Marianne. Now that is very confusing, and if you know the story, you know the story. If you don't, it's really good. Even though my explanation of it was like all over the place, it's really good, believe me. Now, it's called Sense and Sensibility. Here, let me take the elastic part off. There, that's better. Oh no. Okay, it's called Sense and Sensibility. It's called Sense and Sensibility because Eleanor is very sensible. She is practical, she is smart, she can see the big picture. Marianne has a lot of sensibility. She shows her feelings. She shows her passions. She doesn't hide a single thought or emotion. So it's really about how the story isn't so much about all those different love relationships I just talked about. It's mainly about the sisters, their relationships to each other, and their relationships with the world. Let's talk Edward and Eleanor. Edward and Eleanor fall in love near the beginning of the book, aren't given much time actually in the book. Edward is a good man. He basically only makes one mistake in the whole book, but that one mistake is a big one. And that is when he realizes that he is falling in love with Eleanor and Eleanor is falling in love with him, he does not go away. Now, the reason why this is a mistake is because Edward is engaged. He's engaged to somebody else. So when he realized that he was having those feelings, and especially that Eleanor was returning those feelings, he really should have left instead of almost leading her on by being there. Sometimes he would act cold and distant, which would just be confusing, but other times he would be himself. So it was a very strange thing that Eleanor and her, Marianne, Margaret, and her mother didn't know what to think. Now, of course, another option would be for Edward to break it off with Lucy and then come back and see Eleanor and continue things with that. But Edward is a man of honor, and I will explain more how in that culture that would not have been appropriate. Ultimately, though, I think it would have been way better for Eleanor to hear this news coming from Edward instead of coming from Lucy. In seeking to honor Lucy, Edward dishonored Eleanor. All that to say, even though Edward made that choice, he is one of my favorite people in the book. He is one of the most honorable men in all of Jane Austen. He is kind, he is sweet to everyone, not just people who he's interested in, and of course, he sticks to his word. Now, in John Mullen's book, What Matters in Jane Austen, he explains how in that time, women they didn't have the freedom to ask men to marry them. They didn't have the freedom to make that choice. They only had the freedom to say yes or no to the man asking them. Whereas men, of course, had the freedom to choose which woman they wanted to pursue that woman, and then ask her to marry him. Yeah. So, but a freedom that women had that the man didn't is that the woman could change her mind. If she said yes to a man, she could still change her mind and say, actually, no, I don't want to marry you. And that is something that Jane Austen herself did. However, Edward could not change his mind. According to his culture, if he did go back to Lucy and say, actually, I don't want to marry you, that would be going against the cultural rules, and that would be extremely dishonorable to Lucy. So you can kind of get where he's coming from, but he still should have left Eleanor alone then when he realized that she had feelings for him. Let's talk Eleanor and Marianne. Growing up, I was much more of a Marianne than an Eleanor, but as I've gotten older, I've become more like Eleanor and less extreme as Marianne. So it's kind of like I'm a mix. And honestly, I think having a mix of both sense and sensibility is important. You want to have passion, you want to have fire, you want to love things, you want to, explore your emotions, but at the same time, you want sense to guide that. You don't want to be totally out of control. You want to be able to go, okay, if I, yell and scream here about how awful my life is, maybe that'll affect the people around me. Maybe I should, be aware of that. So you do want both those things. Now, it does seem as though the narrator kind of applauds Eleanor more than Marianne, and I'll say a quote to back that up. Marianne says to Eleanor, I don't compare my behavior with Willoughby's. This is a loose quote. She said, I don't compare my behavior with Willoughby's. I compare it with what it should have been. I compare it with yours. So it's like, yeah, Eleanor did have good behavior, but she also bottled up all of these feelings and emotions inside of her that maybe she shouldn't have. So there is a time to express and communicate our emotions and feelings, but we need to know when and how to do that. We can't just explode all the time. Okay, let's talk Marianne, Willoughby, and Colonel Brandon. Colonel Brandon, when he knows what a scoundrel Willoughby is, and when he finds out what he has done to his own ward, that's the word I'm looking for. When he finds out what Willoughby has done to his ward, he doesn't come out and tell Marianne and Eleanor right away. And part of me wishes that he had, because I feel like he could have saved a lot of heartache for Marianne. But at the same time, I understand why he didn't, because he is Willoughby's rival. And if he came out and said something like that, it might be like, well, you're just saying that because you want Marianne for yourself. Also, I don't think Marianne would have believed him until she saw Willoughby himself rejecting her. I still wish in a way that he could have come out earlier and said what Willoughby did, because he would have saved some heartache, but it is what it is, and it's brilliantly written. So good job, Jane Austen. I love that Colonel Brandon and Willoughby duel over Eliza. This duel actually happens. Colonel Brandon tells Eleanor that he was there to punish, like he did this duel to punish Willoughby. Even though no one was hurt, he was punishing Willoughby. And it's interesting that they're dueling over Eliza, but I'm sure Marianne was in both of their thoughts when they were doing that. Now, I also love that Mrs. Dashwood is convinced that Marianne will be happier with Colonel Brandon than she would have been with Willoughby. I think that's a really interesting quote, how she says that. But I think it's even more interesting that Eleanor is not so convinced. This is at the end of the book. This is when, you're supposed to be like, and they all lived happily ever after. Like, Marianne got rid of that awful scoundrel Willoughby and she married her Prince Charming and she'll be with him until, forever. But it's like, Eleanor, who the narrator has kind of said is the right one for the most part in this book, Eleanor doesn't think that she will be as happy with Colonel Brandon as she would have been with an honorable Willoughby. So it's like, that's really interesting. That gives a new, that's nuanced. That gives a nuance to Sense and Sensibility. And it also is kind of like, aw, but I want her to be happier with Colonel Brandon than with Willoughby. But at the same time, I kind of get it because Colonel Brandon is much older than her. She herself had a big problem with that earlier on in the novel. And not only that, Colonel Brandon is in love with her so much because she reminds him of his former love. And honestly, who wants to marry someone who loves you because you remind them of their former love? Like, you want to be loved for yourself, not because you're similar to some other person. So that's also an interesting thought. Although I think Colonel Brandon does truly love Marianne for who she is, but it's still like, that's a bit of a niggling thing. Even though Colonel Brandon is such a good man, such an honorable man, it does kind of make me not want him and Marianne to be together. I really enjoy the 1995 and the 2008 film adaptations of Sense and Sensibility. In a way, I think they do a better job than the book because they spend more time developing Edward and Eleanor's relationship as well as Willoughby and Marianne's relationship and the love that Colonel Brandon has for Marianne. And then there's less time spent in London and in Cleveland when the fallout of their, basically when it looks like they've lost all hope of having these relationships, that Eleanor and Edward will never be together and Marianne and Willoughby will never be together. There's so much time spent on that in the book, and it almost kind of dragged for me a little bit. I like how in the movies they spend more time with the buildup of the romance so you can really get on, you can really want them to be together, and then less time on the fallout. But there is a brilliant scene in Sense and Sensibility that is not in the 1995 version, and only a small part of it is in the 2008 version, and that is when Willoughby comes to see if Marianne really is dying, and in the end he ends up talking with Eleanor for quite a while. That scene is so good, and it's not in the 1995 and only a tiny bit in the 2008, but the book, the scene in the book is just so good. Okay, that's all I have to say on Sense and Sensibility. So I will give you the answers to those quotes. Now, these quotes are very ironic. So the person saying each of these quotes, I hate money and what good does talking do, are the people who love money and who love talking. So let's start with that first one. What good does talking do? That is spoken by Mrs. Jennings of Sense and Sensibility, the biggest gossip ever. She talks nonstop all the time about everything. The other quote, I hate money, is spoken by Isabella Thorpe, the husband-hunting, gold-snatching, obsessed woman. She's just all about that money. So yeah, I thought that was funny. Let me know if you like that quote idea. Maybe I'll do it for, when I read the next ones. So yeah, for the last part of March, I will be reading Jane Austen at Home by Lucy Worsley, and then I will eventually be getting, whether in March or April, to Mansfield Park. I actually really enjoy Mansfield Park. I know a lot of people, it's their least favorite, but I actually really like it. So anyways, that is all I have to say after this massive long video. Maybe I will cut it in two, I'll have to see. But yeah, may you all be filled with peace, hope, love, and joy. So take care, everyone. Bye.